In this video, we're going to talk about how you can reduce the workload of a game developer so that you can go ahead and make your game more efficiently, quickly, easier, and again, just slice your work in half, all right? So before we begin, really quickly, just take a quick look at the screen, all right? There's a bunch of things here, and this kind of represents what game dev is. It's about art, programming, animations, models, scripts. There's a bajillion things you have to worry about, even personal stuff in your life as well, right? But let me ask you one very important question. Do you actually need to work on every single bajillion component and property and everything that shows up in your game? Probably not. If you really narrow down your focus on the things that actually matter, you can go ahead and already reduce the type of workload that you need to work on. All right. But let me give you this thought experiment to kind of best illustrate how to approach this. All right. Let's say I gave you this structure, right? Like this little bridge thingy. I said, hey man, I need your help. Can you like help me balance this? Like, what can you do to balance the structure so that it stands up right? Right? I'll give you a second. If you said, "Oh yeah, let me like put this block and like put it under there," yeah, that works. That solves the issue. I think it's an obvious choice, and yeah, it requires the work to actually put it in. But if you said, "Hey, let me like take this block in particular, take it off," you still get the same solution. You have a balanced structure, albeit it has less content, right? Because you just took away like a little block and everything. But you also simplified the structure. All right. And I want you to think about that for a second because what we just showcased right here is the concept of via negativa, which is to reduce something as much as possible while still retaining the main function of it. All right. Being said, please remember that in game dev, we're like game dev literally is just inputs and outputs on steroids. All right. You have an object, a component, something, and all you're doing is doing an effect, right? An output. Like you're pressing a button, you're probably moving. That one button that you press causes a direct output or an effect that your game is emulating. Again, game dev in a nutshell is just inputs and outputs. Maybe you have systems, maybe you scale it, maybe you have a bunch of animations. The whole point is you can always break down what your main purpose of this component or mechanic or feature is by doing a simple input output. And by the way, if you roadmap your game, which is basically the enlistment of every single possible task that you're going to do in order to make your game possible, you can clearly see what you need to do in order to build your game. I have a whole video on this on my channel. I'll put the link down below if you're interested in that. Being said, if you know everything you're going to do in your game, you can kind of take like a giant overview and say, okay, is this actually necessary? Do I actually need this button, this system, this effect, right? And so I'm going to give you some cursed reverse scope creep advice. And your goal is to try to reduce as many features as possible so that you can, again, speed up your development process as a whole. All right. Now you have to be careful because there is a thing called oversimplification and you can kind of like mess up. But let me give you a couple of examples, but let me just give you this one example you can find on the channel right now. There's a video that I made called How Your Game Needs Bosses. And I was making this thumbnail for like 2 hours, right? And I'm like, yeah, I got these characters, I got these backgrounds, but I got to do a lot of editing. These characters have a lot of details. And I'm taking too much time just writing it when in reality, what is the purpose of this thumbnail, right? I just want to showcase like a scary boss, giant text. That's all I need, right? So I ended up doing this other thumbnail, and you can quickly see on the right, that's the result. We have the boss, we have an exaggerated like effect, giant text. We don't need the background. We don't need the extra characters and details. Like that's enough. It kind of says the message that we need. And by the way, this was done in 20 minutes rather than the 2 hours of constantly editing and picking the right colors and trying to see what's right. And so you can apply this in game dev. And so I'm going to give you an exact example in game dev right now. So a lot of characters move, right? Not every single game has a moving character, but in this case, we have my character here that's running up, down, left, and right. And by the way, these images, these sprites are not mirrored. They're actually like unique sprites. So there's 8 frames per walking cycle, right? So if you do 8 frames, 4 directions, that is a lot of frames. That's 32 frames of just walk animations everywhere, all right? By the way, we have 2 characters. I did the same thing for the other character that's following us. So 32 times 2 is going to be 64 sprites. There are 64 sprites I have to write, polish, animate, make sure it fits, make sure it looks good. And so that's just a lot of work to do, right? Of course, if you want to like make a game that has these properties, you can absolutely do that, and there's no issues with that. But you'll quickly see that if I have just 2 characters and I'm writing 64 sprites to make them walk, how many other more characters and how many other more sprites do I have to do to, make a lively world, right? There's going to be a lot of work to do. So how do I reduce this? And so there's this other thing that we have to keep in mind, right? What are we doing? We're making a walking animation, right? Why? Because we're trying to emulate motion. So if the purpose is to make movement, then we have to retain that purpose no matter what. So what if I said, hold on, let me reduce this to one or two sprites. All right. We have our character and we have them doing like this little like pose every time they hop from one tile to another. It's quick, it's rapid, it's kind of snappy, and you might even miss it, but you can clearly see in the gameplay that hey, like I'm moving. You can clearly see like the little sprite changes when you do hop from one tile to another, and in a way, you're still emulating the movement as a whole. You may notice it, you may not, but the point is we have we have a record of hey, like you're actually moving and you can visually see that. So I might be visually tricking you at the end of the day, but the point is we still have the same functionality. In other words, I don't need 64 sprites to make sure that I'm walking. I can only use two to go ahead and showcase that I'm moving, right? Of course, there's other techniques we have to pay attention to. For example, we're still using directions. Again, we're still snapping. We still have like the little effect of our character bouncing up and down. But 64 to 8 sprites, that's a giant cut of work. And we're still getting what we need, movement. Now, what if I told you we can reduce this even more? Well, there's a thing called oversimplification, which is what I just mentioned, and you probably don't want to go super, super minimum. But at the same time, you can see here clearly that you have one sprite. This time, instead of it being unique, you're actually flipping it, and you're only using it on the horizontal axis, meaning if you go up or down, you're still facing that way. But if you go left and right, that's when it starts flipping. So, hey, with one sprite, we only need to worry about two directions, and we have the jump effect or the movement effect that we're looking for with just one sprite. Okay, wow, that's so little work to do. At the same time, it probably isn't what we're looking for because we're lacking animation, we're probably lacking the polish. We need more in this case because we kind of went too bare bones. All right, but this is what I'm trying to communicate in game dev. You pick your output, you study the output, and you ask, what can I do to minimize the inputs to still get the same output? All right. So here are a list of practical techniques you can use right now in your game to like reduce the workload, right? So for example, we're talking about sprites right now, and you can always talk about the size, the colors, the shapes, the character design of the actual sprite that you have, right? In the first part, like all the way on the left here, you can see that this sprite is a 128 of 128, right? So it's like a giant canvas. But then on the other one, it's actually 64 by 64. So it's basically like a reduction, right? And because it's smaller, well, that's less sprites to fill out, less pixels to draw, probably less colors to pick from. So it's just an easier way to develop art, especially in the context of, pixel art in this case, right? So always reduce the size. That's something that you can do. Having less features would probably be easier to animate. Another thing is if you have a system that already works in another game project, in a game jam, in another thing that you have, no one's stopping you from just copying and pasting that and putting it into your own game. Maybe doing a little bit of refurbishing, fixing it up a bit. But if something already works, you don't have to fix what's not broken, right? Being said, feel free to recycle as many scripts as possible because that's just a reduction of work. You don't have to rewrite the same script that you already did. Another one is, and I might get some backlash for this, but you can do spaghetti code. All right, like yeah, it's important to be efficient. You want to be, you want your game's performance to be really good. Like it's really important. But if you want to test out a feature, it's just better to write what you know, keep it simple, make it work, and then polish it later. Another thing you can also do is if you're working on something like attack animations, for example, your attack, your attacks or your animations, they don't have to have a bajillion frames to like have a startup, and then you have like 27 more frames to like move the sword. It can be a very simple, okay, startup, attack, post attack, and then recover, something simple, right? And this isn't just for combat. This could be done for pretty much any other type of animation. But you can always reduce the amount of frames necessary to accomplish a movement. If you are a music producer or someone that composes music for video games, motifs are kind of a hack in the sense that you get to recycle kind of like the same song over and over again, but you kind of like remix it in subtle ways and you actually kind of build more like a narrative role, or like you have more character themes overlapping with each other. But recycling motifs in particular kind of makes the music composition part easier because now you don't have to worry about designing new original themes when you can just say, oh, I like this segment, let me kind of mix this part, okay, let me extend this part, and you can just generate a ton of songs with this. And finally, another example is, hey, like if you're dealing with a color palette, not that it automates the color selection choice, but the fact that you can just kind of pick a couple of colors and it just automatically looks good no matter what combination you have, that's going to be very helpful for you whenever you're designing art. So again, these are just a couple of things, but the main point is you are delegating the technical work while retaining the purpose of what you're trying to do. And by the way, you can also delegate the actual work to like someone else that, like if you know a sprite artist, for example, yeah, give them the sprite artwork. You can go ahead and work on the programming. But the message is the same. Delegate, delegate, delegate technical parts. Keep the output the way that you want it to, and just see what are the shortcuts you can continue to take without losing the quality of the game. And by the way, you have to be very careful with shortcutting, because if you do this too often, or if you cut too many corners, your game might feel lifeless, right? Like maybe it's lacking that polish, maybe it's lacking those effects, maybe you do need more animations, maybe you do need a little bit more juice in your game to continuously make it feel and look great. At the same time, you can still shortcut your game, and it might not be super noticeable, but it can still feel great. So as you can see on the left, this is my lifeless version of Dodge King number 1. But on the right, you can see this is Dodge King Deluxe, which I still took a lot of shortcuts, but you can still see it feels juicier, it feels good. You still have the properties that make the game feel alive. Granted, there's a lot of shortcuts, but at the same time, that's kind of like what we game developers do. We kind of trick our players into seeing cool visuals and how they feel whenever they play the game, right? So how do I evaluate the work that I'm doing? And then how do I say, well, like, can I reduce that? Is that something that's possible? And this is a very simple flowchart where truly all you're looking at is the property of the object that you're creating, right? So again, maybe you're working on a mechanic, maybe you're working on an animation, maybe you're working on a character, an effect, a sound, the size of something, right? So properties can be divided into quantities and qualities, right? So quantitative is like the amount, just number based stuff that you can like scale. Qualitative is more about like the process that you take and like how good it feels, right? It's more like an estimation of like how you would feel regarding uh, the effect of something, right? So the whole point is you take these properties and you just want to reduce it. So quantitative is easier because now you can say, okay, well, can I make the big size smaller? Can I make less frames? Can I choose less colors? Can I make simpler shapes? Can I use less particles? Can I use less effects? Is the cost, and by cost I mean kind of like performance and everything, can I lower that, right? Are these things that I can do? And if so, you reduce them and you repeat the cycle until you cannot reduce any further, all right? Qualitative is a little bit more tricky because now that's kind of like bleeding into the art style, the actual like game feel effects, the feedback systems you have, how it feels when you generate risk and reward fulfillment. It's a little bit more subjective, and that's more of like the game director's choice. So you have to like be very careful here. But ask yourself like, hey, I blew up my enemy and there's like a bunch of particles. They're smoking. The screen's shaking like crazy. Do I want to reduce that, or do I want to like leave it as it is, right? And so you probably want to lean more into like leaving those properties alone when it comes to the quality part, most more than likely. But there are certain cases where you probably do want to have that reduction, specifically for performance purposes, right? But this is all you have to do: reduce it, and then at the new reduced state, recycle. Do it again. Can I reduce this again? Okay. Can I do it again? Keep cycling this, like keep reducing until you realize, you know what, I don't think I can cut any more corners. It's still good. I'll continue. But also be careful, because if you cut too many corners, you're going to have a lifeless game. So ultimately, I just want to leave this video with you having this thought process. When you're adding a feature, when you're adding anything in your game, remember that thought experiment we did at the beginning. Think about it very carefully. Do you really need what you think you need? Before you commit to that choice, do that little analysis. Do I need this? Can I reduce it? Does it have to be here? Do I have to spend $3,000 billion on this like cool particle effect when I can just have like a couple of sprites that show up on the screen for a second? Like, think about it very carefully. All right. And when you start dropping dead weight, you'll quickly realize, wait, I'm reducing my workload. I'm getting faster. I'm more efficient. I'm still delivering the effects that I want from my game. Huh. Maybe I feel like I'm fast forwarding.